Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar on Docker and container compliance. My name is Kishore Vaswani, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of ControlCase. First of all, let me thank you for taking the time today to attend this webinar on Docker and container compliance with ControlCase. A few housekeeping items before we get started. We will be sending a copy of these slides as well as a recording of this webinar to everybody on this call, so you will certainly be getting a recording of this. Also, this webinar and all other webinars will be posted on our website at www.controlcase.com. As we go through the webinar today, if you have any difficulties hearing me, or if you have any difficulties hearing me and looking at the screen, please feel free to put in our chat window, and our moderators will be looking at it for any audio or visual difficulties. Also, as we go through the session today, if you have any questions, please put them in the questions window, and we will make sure we answer that in the order we receive the questions. That being said, again, thank you for attending this webinar, and we shall get started here shortly. Our agenda today will include an introduction to ControlCase. Then we'll talk at a more general level about Docker and containers. When we talk about Docker and containers at a more general level, we will try to keep it simple and talk about terminology that you may have heard before, but we will try to keep it simple and straightforward. We will then get into Docker and container compliance specifically, and while we'll provide you with a checklist of things that should be taken care of at a detailed level, certainly I will try to again keep this at a level that is simplistic and something that you can then take back from this webinar and action it within your environment, or action it as you're looking to move and use containers in your IT infrastructure footprint in the future. We will end up with a brief description of ControlCase and how at ControlCase we address some of the compliance issues with Docker and containers, and then we will get into questions and answers. We should probably have at least 5 to 10 minutes for Q&A. This webinar is expected to run about 30 minutes, including Q&A. And so again, just please feel free to put things in the chat window as we go along, as you have any issues with hearing me and anything that you have questions on, please put them in the questions window, and we will make sure we address them in the order we are receiving them. A little bit about ControlCase. So we focus exclusively on IT certifications and related continuous compliance services. We go beyond the auditor's checklist and are really your partners in ensuring that we provide a partnership approach to getting you compliant and certified, and also driven through automation, driven through content and technology automation for ensuring that your certification and continuous compliance is managed in an effective manner. Just for reference, here are some types of certifications and compliance regimes we can work with, and this gives you a high level of the types of certifications in the IT space. We are either able to help you get compliant or are able to actually certify you too. That was a brief introduction to ControlCase. Now, let's get into Docker and container. We have heard a lot about Dockers and containers, and again, I will try to make sure I keep it at a level that maybe folks are able to digest it at a more higher level while still having content for a more detailed discussion within your organizations. So basically, a container really means the ability to run applications and worry about your applications without worrying that much about your operating system or physical security. So again, if companies want to focus just on building code and deploying code and not worry as much about the operating systems or the physical security and all the different other networking components to go with it, that's what essentially containers help you do. You've heard of Docker, you've heard of AWS ECS, you've heard of Google's Kubernetes. All these are popular containerization solutions. Specifically, Docker is an open source software, so any company, even with their own data center, can use Docker to implement container technology. Amazon has implemented ECS as its containerization technology. Google has implemented GKE or Kubernetes as its containerization technology. So I want to make sure I focus on and recap what the terminology is. So when you hear containers, when you hear containerization, that essentially is a feature. It's a technology. It's really a feature which enables you to focus on your applications without having to focus at the operating system and network layer as much. So it is containers. Containers are a feature. Docker is an actual open source software that enables the container feature. So Docker is actually a software which any company can implement to enable the container feature within your infrastructure. ECS is really Amazon's implementation of containers. So if you're not using your own data center, but you're using Amazon's data center, you can use the ECS technology. Same way, GKE or Kubernetes is Google's implementation of the containers. So containers are a feature. How you can implement it? You can use Docker, you can use ECS, you can use GKE. And I just wanted to make sure if nothing else, that I made you aware of what the terminology is when you hear these features and you hear these terms out in the industry: container, Docker, ECS, GKE. Hopefully this starts to give you an idea of how to tie all these terminologies together. Now, what are the hosting models? There are 4 kinds of hosting models. We have always had, a company can host things internally. You can use a data center. In the last decade or so, cloud has become extremely common. And now let's add one more hosting model, which is the cloud-hosted container service. So 4 hosting models that exist when it comes to containers. Before I get into Docker and container compliance, I just want to reiterate a recap of the terminology because this is very important. Containers are a feature. Docker, ECS, and Kubernetes are various implementations of the container feature. Docker for your data center, ECS for Amazon, GKE or Kubernetes for Google. All right, so now that we have level set in terms of what is the terminology being used out there, let's now get into the meat of what, if your organization is looking to either move there or already is there, what are some of the things you can think about as you think about Docker and container compliance? So first of all, compliance from, we talked about the 4 hosted models, or hosting models. I'm not going to get into details about each of these boxes, but essentially what this tells you is that for the cloud container service providers, the provider, whether it's Amazon or Google or your own internal cloud, the hardware and the OS layer is really provided by your cloud provider or your data center provider. The container layer or management of containers and the application itself is the client's responsibility, i.e., all of you are still responsible for that level of management, because essentially you have to worry less about the operating system layer and hardware layer, but absolutely the application and the code and the way you deploy it within containers is absolutely something that still remains within your organization. Here's an example of compliance responsibility matrix. This shows you that using containers does not get you to a point where you do not have to worry about any and all domains. It certainly makes sure that you are, not worried about physical security anymore. It makes sure that there is a shared responsibility between you as a customer and the cloud environments you're using. But a lot of the application layer, the scoping layer, the encryption layer, the security layer that is really embedded in your application and in your code still remains your responsibility. In the past, you were worried about operating system level controls. Now you had to be worried about container level deployment controls. So it's a different level of things you got to look at when you're looking at compliance when containers are being used. And so this is just intended to give you a sense that it is not the silver bullet. Compliance is still a responsibility that you have to look at. I'm going to go through a checklist of top 10 things that we feel are good for compliance. We're going to talk about the technology difference as to how it differs from your traditional cloud-based environments, and then the compliance best practice. As I mentioned, we will be sending this slides as well as this webinar to everybody, so you can use this as a checklist in your organization, or make sure you're looking at these as you deploy container technology within your organization. I'll go at a high level. Number one, the traditional deployment practices, patching, subsystem upgrades do not really apply exactly the same to a containerized environment. And so what you got to make sure is that your developers are trained specifically in container secure practices. Not the general purpose secure development practices, but secure practices keeping containers in mind. And so training your developers is extremely important. When you use containers, the attack surface is actually much smaller than you would have with a general purpose operating system, so which is a good thing. So you can use container-specific operating systems to reduce the attack surface, and that adds to your defense in depth strategy. However, you should note that the container-specific operating systems will have different kind of vulnerabilities over time that you need to be able to look at. The third one is you got to ensure that you're segmenting your containers by purpose, so that when you, just like when you segment your network, in this case, you want to segment your containers so that a security problem in one does not flow over to another container and the applications contained in there. Number fourth, again, you have been used to hardening your traditional network infrastructure. Well, over here, what you have to do is harden the orchestrator configurations, which mean these are your deployment methods for containers. Orchestrators deploy containers, and so you got to make sure you're hardening your orchestrator configurations, just like you would do in the traditional environment. A lot of you are used to vulnerability scanning tools for your network. Those exact same ones will not necessarily work, and so you got to adopt tools and processes that are focused on scanning vulnerabilities for your container environment. Same thing as it goes for vulnerability management, goes for monitoring. Network and monitoring, as you do normal monitoring, will not work here, and you need container-aware network monitoring tools to monitor your container network. You got to make sure the number 7 that access control capabilities are enabled between different containers, just like we talked about segmentation earlier. As we get to the end of the list, your traditional tools for software management, such as code management, may not work exactly the same. You have to make sure that you're using software and software management tools that interact well with a segmented container network. And then finally, the last piece is that your traditional segregation techniques may not work, so you should have different containers and a good segmentation strategy for development, test, and production. I will summarize again here for you the 10 best practices. Train developers, use specific host operating systems, group containers wherever possible, harden orchestrators, use specific vulnerability management tools, use specific monitoring tools, use access control, segment your workloads, ensure you're only using approved software uploads with digital images, and then separate your development, test, and production environment. So this hopefully forms a good checklist of the types of things you can do when you are looking at deploying a container technology within either your network or using one of the clouds for it. So far I have covered, number 1, what is the terminology, which is containers is a technology, and then Dockers and Amazon and Google are various methods to implement the Docker container technology, the container technology. We went through what are 10 best practices that can be used. As we get towards the end of this webinar, I will outline some of the control case compliance solutions for container technologies. So at control case, again, we focus on IT compliance and IT certifications. So we do have a whole slew of cybersecurity services that help you achieve IT compliance, including solutions that help in the container technology. So things we do at various layers include vulnerability scanning, we do configuration scanning, we do application scanning, we do penetration testing, and then we help you build policies and procedures for the container environment. So when it comes to the container environment, these are types of things we are able to do. Certainly, we ensure that we are providing you dashboards of compliance, whether it be your traditional data center model, your cloud model, or your container-enabled cloud model. At the highest level, here is how ControlCase provides you the automation that you need. We have a centralized dashboard of compliance that you as a customer or you as a potential customer can log on to see where you stand in your certification and compliance process. We have matched multiple regulations and are able to take those feeds from GRC platforms. We are able to automate the evidence collection for various environments, including the environments we talked about today. And then through our artificial intelligence enabled techniques, we are able to predict and provide continuous compliance on an ongoing basis for various environments, and that could include a combination of environments across your traditional data centers, across your traditional cloud, or across your container-enabled cloud networks, including the various clouds that exist out there. We certainly help you. At the end of the day, we provide you with compliance and certification, and we are always your partners in the process. We enable technology wherever possible, and we ensure that we work with you on continuous compliance versus just a point-in-time compliance. We thank you for your time that you have spent with us learning about this technology. At this point, please go ahead and type your questions in the questions matrix, and I will answer them in the order we receive them. I see we have a bunch of questions here, and we will start answering them in the order that we receive them. The first question is, do you know if AWS includes this in their responsibility matrix? And thank you for that question. I would say I don't know specifically whether about AWS, but I don't know about the specifics of this. But certainly, the place you would want to ensure you look at when you are trying to determine the exact responsibility matrix, the product that you're looking at from an AWS perspective would be maybe different for different products. So you would have to look at the exact products you're using and then see if they have a responsibility matrix for that specific product. And on your second question, ECS is exactly that. I believe that if you go look at Amazon's ECS product, that is where the container and technology is implemented within Amazon. And so if you try to look for Amazon ECS responsibility matrix, you should be able to check what things are you responsible for and what are you and what is Amazon responsible for. To answer your question, there should be a responsibility matrix, I believe. I'm not sure, but the place to look at would be Amazon ECS, because Amazon ECS is Amazon's implementation of containers. The next question is, and please feel free to add additional questions if it wasn't clear. The next question is, what are the potential attack vectors against containers? So I would broadly classify the attack vectors against containers into two buckets. One bucket is the same bucket which you have always been used to, which is your application security vectors, or OWASP top 10, OWASP top 20, because at the end of the day, this is still code that you have written. You have just deployed it in a different manner. So even if you're using container technology, the first broad vector would still be your OWASP or your application security vulnerabilities. The second attack vector would be attacking the actual configuration of the containers. So again, remember, containers are just compartmentalizing your application code and putting it under different buckets without you having to worry about the operating system. But containers themselves are deployable and have to be managed. And so just like any technology we have seen with virtualization, you have had hypervisors that have to be managed. Same way with containers, orchestration has to happen, and that management of that technology is an important attack vector that needs to be looked at. Kind of related to that is, what is the attack surface? The attack, surface of containers would again be, your application code as well as the configuration of your orchestration solution for containers. The next one is, in terms of PCI segmentation, is it possible to segment a PCI and a non-PCI container? And that answer is, done right, absolutely. Containerization is probably a good technique to segment two types of functions that may exist in an environment, and is a very valid method. Again, if done right, with all security controls taken right, containers are a good way to implement segmentation for PCI and for other regulations. It absolutely makes sense that sometimes you want to separate your PCI data from your healthcare data, from your federal data, and containers with the right level of security around it are a great way to do that, and you won't have to worry as much about the operating system layer or the network layer. The next question is, do containers need to be audited? And the answer is, let's take a step back. Let's see, number one, what regulation or regulations you are responsible for. Number two, for those regulations, if you require a third-party auditor and need to get IT certified, to the extent you're using this as part of your footprint for technology, it absolutely needs to be audited, because just like anything else, containers have settings. Your application code still has vulnerabilities that have always existed. Containers get a new level of settings to help you enable containers, but which means it introduces a new set of checks that need to be done from an IT compliance and certification perspective. The next question is, does the cloud service provider or the provider of the container solution support the audit, and can it be on a multi-tenant network? The answer is, as I said earlier, and as the first question I had answered, as an example, AWS should have a responsibility matrix for Amazon's ECS implementation, which is the Amazon's equivalent of containers. And so the cloud service provider should be able to partner with you and provide you a responsibility matrix, number one. Number two, they could obviously tell you which areas you're responsible for and which areas they are responsible for. However, if you go back to the presentation we just did, and I will just bring it up again a little bit so that it becomes more clear, more or less, you can look at this and you can see where the responsibility matrix lies, typically when it comes to Amazon and Google Clouds as you relate to your container environment. And you will all get a copy of this presentation, so you can look up against that, and then of course reach out to the actual cloud providers that you might be using for this. Well, that was the last question I had. Thank you for your time on attending this webinar. Hope you found it useful. Please go to our website, www.controlcase.com, to look at future webinars. You will get a copy of this slide and recordings as you go through your webinars. Thank you so much. Thank you for attending. We look forward to continuing to speak with you.